All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to True Crime Loser. How are ya? So I'm back in New York City. For the past 4 days, I've been in Arizona celebrating Grandma Schmida's 90th birthday, and it was great. The party was great. The food was great. My grandma was glowing. We celebrated her 90th year, and what a time. The whole family was out there. But the first morning that I was out there, my girlfriend and I are staying at my grandparents' little house, and we get up and we're eating breakfast and we're drinking coffee, and we tell them about the True Crime Loser YouTube channel. They didn't know I was doing it. And so there, my grandpa's 91. My grandma just turned 90 yesterday, so they're sitting there and they're like, oh, I don't know if they ever go on YouTube, but they get it and they think it's really cool. And my grandpa, who's 91, goes over and gets his iPad and goes and gets on True Crime Loser, and he's clicking around for a while. We're eating breakfast. And after maybe about 20 minutes, he puts his iPad away and he comes over and he goes, all right, Scott, I got one for you. And so my girlfriend and I and my grandma all sit down for my grandpa to tell this story. And he's a good storyteller. And he's very calm and he doesn't really get loud. And so he tells us this story that I'm going to tell you guys right now for this episode. And so just a little context is my great-grandpa, my grandpa who's telling this story, his dad in 1914 was trying to rent a ranch from an owner for 3 years, but the guy would only rent it for 1 year. And so my great-grandpa, his name's Carl Sharp. So Carl says, you know what, the hell with this. I'm going to homestead in Colorado. He's going to do the homestead program, which what that is this is before really the United States has moved west. Everybody's moving west. So there's essentially unlimited land out west. It just went on forever. It still does. If you've been to the middle of the United States of America, it's just flat, prairie, rolling hills, lonely land for as long as the eye can see. It is lonely out there. And so Carl, my great-grandpa, signs up where he gets 80 acres in Colorado on the very eastern part of Colorado in a town called Last Chance. And he gets 80 acres, and you get, if you got a farmer ranch on it, and you got to pay taxes on the land, but the government just gives it to you. And so he gets his 80 acres in Last Chance, and he and a couple other Sharps in the family take a train with everything they own all the way out to Colorado. And then once they get to Colorado, they put everything they own on a horse and carriage, and there wasn't even a road. It just was a road and then a dirt road, and then the dirt road disappeared, and they just, on a wagon with horses, went into the unknown, just straight into nothingness. And the plan was they would get out there and build a little sod house just out of mud and grass, and then when they got a house put up, then a couple other people in the family would come out, and then they would attempt to try to turn that land into a ranch that they could live off of. And so Carl, and there's a funny story, it's a letter. So I'm getting a lot of the information off this. One of my relatives made this whole book with letters and newspaper clippings, and so they get out there and they build a sod house, and then the next wave of the family comes out. And in a letter, the next wave, they get out there and they're looking around, and it's just nothing. I can't even describe how in the middle of nowhere it is. There's no law enforcement, there's no fire, there's no grocery stores, there's nothing. Even to this day in Last Chance, Colorado, all there is a church and a firehouse. Even in 2019, there's not one single business there. And so the second wave of the family gets out there and they're riding out to the land in the horse and wagon. And one of them that had been out there like looked at him and was like, "So, what do you guys think?" And one of them looked around and goes, "There's nothing to think about. It just really is just nothing, just grasslands." The thumbnail that I'm using for this video is a picture of the ranch, but a generation later when my dad was growing up on it. So all those permanent structures. So it is just nothing, right? And so they homestead and turn it into a working ranch. And a lot of people that went out there failed because it's a hard, lonely life out there. And so as people would fail around my great-grandpa and want to leave and go back east, he would take over paying taxes on their land. And so he went from, and then he would be able to use that land and it would be his. So as people left and he started taking over, he went from 80 acres to about 3,000 for this ranch. And the last story I'm going to tell about Carl is in 1934. And this just shows you how just Wild West it was out there. So at this point, Carl had been working on the ranch for 20 years, and there's no fences, and so there's a lot of feuding over property lines and all that stuff. So in 34, the guy that owned the ranch right next to our families was named Essie, and Essie kept mowing a little bit farther over Carl's property line, every time. So it was a little bit, and then he kept kind of trying to push the property line over by mowing. And my great-grandpa, Carl, was like, after a while, like, the hell with this, and so I'm putting up a fence. And so he starts putting up a fence, and one day, Essie sees him putting up a fence, and he pulls up, parks, and gets out of his truck with a hammer and starts walking over towards Carl. And Carl pulls out a pistol, and puts it right in his face. And because Essie is a snitch and a coward, he called the sheriff later that night. So later that night, the sheriff shows up. The closest sheriff is 30 miles away. It takes about an hour to get out there. And so the sheriff shows up and arrests my great-grandpa, Carl, for carrying an illegal firearm and assault with a deadly weapon. And Essie's story is that he just came up and put a gun in his face. And our family story is that he walked up with a hammer, causing Carl to put a gun in his face. Carl goes to trial, gets convicted of carrying an illegal firearm and assault with a deadly weapon. And the penalty, ready for this, is $25 fine and 60 days in jail. But if he pays the fine, he doesn't have to do the jail time. And he also had to pay court costs, which were $1.25. And so Carl and his wife raise kids, and one of those kids is my grandpa that's telling me this story, and he marries my grandma, Betty. Her parents had also homesteaded, so they were in a ranch, in the area, and they met at the little high school, and they get married when they're teenagers, and they take over Carl's ranch. And poor Carl died of a bowel obstruction at some point. So my grandma and grandpa, who I hung out with all weekend, they take over this ranch, and they have 4 boys. They actually had 5 boys, but one of them died in just a horrible farming accident. And so they have 4 boys, and they're out on this ranch in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, nothing around. no law really, and that's where this story starts. Oh yeah, I want to tell one other story. So we still have family. This will just tell you how wild it still is out there. So we still have family out there. One of my cousins was telling me this story. So he still lives out there. He's in his like 50s or 60s at this point, but recently they're out there and they had a prairie fire, which is just a huge grass fire, and it moves with the wind, so it just, these huge fields catch on fire. And the way you got to fight it is you got to get ahead of it and dig like a trench so it doesn't have anything. I'm sure it's just a total nightmare. So my cousin Larry, who's just a funny guy, and I always just wanted to sit next to him when I was annoying because I just always wanted to be around him, hear him tell stories when I was little. But recently they had this huge prairie fire, and Larry is out there trying to fight it, and he's in a truck, and the fire's moving so fast that it passes him in his truck. So all around him, he's just engulfed in flames. It's every window he looks out of is just totally black, and to try to get out of the fire, he floors it. But he's at this point, because it's all black and there's just fire everywhere, he gets turned around, and so he has no idea. He's flooring it. And if you're not on a road out there, it's just bumpy as hell. So he's just flooring it, and he has no idea if he's heading far, because he's all just turned around and discombobulated, and he has no idea if he's driving further into the fire or parallel to the fire or the right way out of the fire. And he's just flooring it, and he has no idea. And he said he was sitting there just in the bumpy truck, no idea where he was going, and he just, in that moment, kind of made his peace with the universe and that he might die. And it just, and then right when he sort of thought, well, this is it, he just, boom, he popped out into the clean sunshine air. And I always just think, man, like when that was happening, while he was just sitting there making his peace in a fiery hell with black in all the windows, I was probably in New York, like ordering a lobster roll or something, being like, hey, this is kind of nice out here. But it's still, the point is, it's still just rough, lonely country out there. All right, so this story is in 1952. So my grandpa sits us down and says, I got one for you, Scott. And so in 1952, my grandma and grandpa are in their 20s. They have 3 kids, and they're working on this ranch. And my grandpa's very handy, always doing projects, can really just do anything, can build anything. And so at this point, he's putting in a septic tank out there. You're always just trying to improve your situation out there. So he's putting in, they're digging, and they're doing it all themselves. They're digging this big thing. They're going to put in a new septic tank. And while he's doing this, a neighbor comes over that lives 3 hours away on a ranch named Clarence Hass. So he comes over to check. He heard my grandpa was putting in this septic tank, so he comes over to check to see how it's going. And so my grandpa and grandma, they're talking to Clarence. My grandpa's showing them how it's going, and my grandpa said that Clarence had been in the service and that he was a big hunter, and so the phrase my grandpa used is he was a real crack shot with a rifle, just a really good shot. And so there's, hey, look, check out the septic tank. Oh, that's looking good. They're doing neighborly stuff. And yeah, they thought Clarence was a good guy. And at this time, I asked my grandpa, he estimated that at this time of this story, their ranch had 1,000 sheep, 30 cows, 50 chicken, 5 pigs, a dog, and a few cats. So this was, it's a big working sheep ranch. And yeah, so, they're doing it. And Clarence, like I said, lived 3 miles away on a ranch with his mom. And my grandpa described his mom as a little too religious. She was just a little too into it. And her strategy to deal with any problem or anything that her and Clarence would fight about, or just any problem that Clarence had, was just, more religion and her religious views. And my grandpa said she would really push her religious views on Clarence. And Clarence, wasn't really having it, and it would lead to these huge fights. They would have these huge fights, or Clarence would threaten his mom, and they're just in the middle of nowhere. So it would have to be scary for his mom, if Clarence would get mad. So on this particular day in 52, they got in a big fight, Clarence and his mom. And Clarence must have threatened her or gotten scary or something, because his mom leaves. And she calls the sheriff, who's 30 miles away, and said, Clarence is got in a fight. He threatened me. I was scared, so I left. So the sheriff, who knew Clarence pretty well, had been out there a few times, was like, okay, the deputy and I will drive down there, and we'll talk to Clarence, we'll see what's going on, we'll make sure everything's okay. And so the sheriff and the deputy head out from 30 miles away. Like I said, it takes about an hour, because the roads become dirt, and then the dirt becomes more dirt. There's a lot of dirt out there. And so all right, we'll go talk to Clarence. And so they head out to Clarence. Well, my grandparents, Jack and Betty, they had decided to go to the movies this day, drive all the way into town, couple hours into town to see, and my grandpa called it the picture show. And so they drive in to the picture show, which is an all-day event. So they drive in to town to see a movie, and so they're not really around. And that mid-afternoon, the sheriff and the deputy show up to the Hass Ranch. They get there, and they get out of the car. They pull up, and they get out of the car, and Clarence shoots them both dead. One shot each with a .30-30. And the sheriff was closer to the house, and the deputy was still in the police cruiser. So what may have happened is they pulled up, and the sheriff goes, hey, all right, I'll be back in a second. He gets out of the car, and from inside the house, Clarence takes him out, and then the deputy was still in the car. So possibly from inside the house, Clarence shot he's a good shot. He shot the sheriff, and then made the shot while he's sitting in the car. And there's that song, I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot the deputy. Clarence laid them both out. So he shoots the sheriff and the deputy dead, and then he lights the haystack on fire, and then he lights the house on fire, and then he leaves. He disappears. And so a neighboring ranch, some neighbors, everybody's very spread out. So way far away, these neighbors see smoke, thick black smoke. And imagine this scene. You're a rancher in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, and you look up and you see this black smoke, and there's not really the fire. The fire department is just the neighbors. If you have a fire, you just call your neighbors to help you. And so they see this smoke, and they go over there, and imagine walking up on this scene, a sheriff's cruiser with the door open, the sheriff dead, the deputy dead, and the huge haystack and the house on fire, and Clarence nowhere to be found. And so this turned into a manhunt with an armed and dangerous man. And so the word spreads that Clarence is on the loose with a gun, with his .30-30, and possibly homicidal, suicidal, whatever it is. And so the word spreads all around, and so everybody that night, as it gets dark, everybody that night plans to stay up, guns ready, lights on, in case Clarence comes to one of their houses. It's almost like when someone escapes from prison and all the houses in the immediate area have to be on alert because the person has to go somewhere. And so it's this high tension. Everybody's staying up. Everyone's getting their dogs and their guns ready to stay up all night to make sure Clarence doesn't come over. Well, my grandparents, Jack and Betty, have been at the movies, so they get back, late that evening. And because they've been gone, they haven't heard anything. They haven't heard the news. And so they get home like nothing's different. And they put the kids to bed, and they go to bed as if, it's a normal night. And the scary thing is my grandma was telling me that even if Clarence would have come over that night, even if they would have been sleeping and they heard the dog go nuts and they heard a knock on the door, if they would have opened it up and it would have been Clarence, since they hadn't heard about this and they thought highly of him, or at least, neighborly of him. And so she said, I would have let him in. And, luckily he didn't come over. But then the next day, this manhunt is still going. The next day, a police or a sheriff or somebody, a police sees a guy walking down the highway about 40 miles from his house. So he made it a long way. 40 miles holding a gun. He had sawed off the stock of his 30-30 for a pistol grip. And he was walking just down the highway, holding the 30-30 on his side, just kind of walking. And the police saw him and started to kind of close in, pulled around, and as he started to close in, Clarence put that 30-30 in his mouth and just blew his brains out right there on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in Colorado. And I thought that was a great story. It just really was a different time, I don't know what else to say, but it was a wild one. I don't know. I really have no idea who I'm going to do next, the big case. I know a lot of people like to know. I'm going to see if I can get interested in something today and try to start one tomorrow. But if you do like this channel, think about supporting me on the Patreon. If you're having a tough time money-wise, that's okay. A like and a comment is support too. Thank you to everyone that participates like that. It's good to be back. I love you all. That's the show. We're not here for any reason, George. Have a good one, everybody. Shmita.